GLF's Brave New World welcomes you back to our second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session today with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with our sessions with Paul Muldoon and so many others, you can catch them on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session for the day is Lessons from History. Award-winning economic historian Niall Ferguson and Maya Jasanoff delve into the history of pandemics and share their perspectives on one of the most pressing questions of our time. Niall Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He's also the author of 15 books, including The Pity of War, The House of Rothschild, Empire, Civilization, and Kissinger, 1923 to 1968, The Idealist, which won the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize. His most recent book, The Square and the Tower, was published in the US in 2018 and was a New York Times bestseller. Ferguson's detailed study of economic data on the pandemic tracks the path and predicts the future of today's world crisis. Maya Jasanoff is the XD and Nancy Yang Professor of the Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She's also the author of the prize-winning books Edge of Empire and Liberty's Exile, which received the 2012 National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and the George Washington Book Prize. Her 2017 book, The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World, has been hailed as one of the most important books on colonialism to be written in our time. Her teaching and research extends from the history of the British Empire to global history and examines the dynamics of modern globalization. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, which is most likely, I've dropped off 3 times already today, just hang in there and we'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, Lessons from History. Niall Ferguson and Maya Jasanoff in conversation.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and lovely to see you, Niall, on my screen, and welcome to all of you who are joining us on the different live feeds. So as you can probably tell by this side-by-side shot, Niall and I are rather different characters. I am here in my book-lined study in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with a Ganesh perched on the shelf behind me, and for that matter, a copy of the Indian Constitution alongside my Hindi textbooks. And Niall is joining us from Montana with crossed swords on the wall, and he informs me a gun in the corner. And the two of us have played on our manifest differences to productive effect some years ago when Niall was also at Harvard, and we co-taught a course together in which we tried to share some lessons from history with our students. So it's in that spirit that we're rejoining today. Now, Niall, over recent years, has been extremely involved as the founder and head of a strategic and financial advisory firm called Greenmantle. And I think it's in that role, as well as that of course, a practicing historian, that you, Niall, have devoted what looks at least like a huge amount of time over recent months to tracking the spread of the pandemic, the public health responses, the financial responses, the political responses, and much more. And I wonder if you could give us a bit of a flavor of your 750 slide deck at last count, and share with us some of your basic insights to date about this pandemic.
Well, thanks, Maya, and it's great to see you, even if we are geographically far apart. And it's also a delight to see the Jaipur Literary Festival team, Sanjoy, and all my old friends there. It's been too long since I've been at the festival, but this is a great opportunity to reconnect. Maya, as an historian, I think I've had several brushes with pandemics. It's hard to avoid them if you are a student of Pretty much anything from ancient Rome through to 19th century European cities. I seem to remember we even taught one of our classes on an infectious disease problem, unless amnesia is kicking in. So it's something that you and I have thought about and studied. I wrote about the cholera, the pandemic, rather, of influenza in 1918-19 in my book, The Pity of War, as one of the reasons that the German army collapsed in the middle of 1918. So when I heard that there was a new and mysterious pneumonia or virus in Wuhan in the first week of January, a little alarm bell went off in my head. I happened to be traveling in Asia then. I was in Taipei, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and I was hearing more and more chat about what was happening there, and it was making me more and more worried. I then flew to the World Economic Forum at Davos and was stunned to find that nobody wanted to talk about the rapidly approaching pandemic. They just wanted to talk about the usual climate change. Greta Thunberg was there. People wanted to touch the hem of her garment. And I began rather indignantly compiling research as it was coming in on what was happening in Wuhan. It wasn't actually work for Greenmantle. It was really pure self-education as I tried to keep track of what I began to realize was going to be a catastrophe. And I wrote then a weekly column for the Sunday Times and Boston Globe. And I think my first article on the subject came out around about that time, so mid-January. It's hard to believe, but even a month later, in mid-February, when I was in Washington, people in the administration were still in complete denial about the probability that the United States would be very hard hit. And I had some rather fraught conversations with people then, trying to persuade them to take the risk seriously. I think the key idea of the deck, which has grown every week by multiple slides, is that one has to understand a pandemic not only in terms of the nature of the pathogen itself, and of course we've learned a lot about SARS-CoV-2 in the last 5 months, but also in terms of the social networks that it attacks. This was a theme of my book, The Square and the Tower, that you have to understand the social network as well as the thing going viral, the virus, in order to understand any contagion. And most of the mistakes in policy that there have been, and there have been many, have really come out of not understanding that and not understanding the peculiar way in which social networks transmit a new pathogen. And also because networks vary from country to country and from place to place, that helps explain why some countries have been much harder hit than others. So that's the central theme. I'll add one final point. Simultaneously with the pandemic of COVID-19, there has been another kind of pandemic, a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic online. And in some ways, the online viruses, the conspiracy theories, for example, are even more contagious than the virus itself, and are adding to the confusion and I think to the errors of judgment that people are making.
Well, there's so many themes to pick out from that, but I think the one that strikes me the most as you're talking is the question of authority and elites. And your anecdote about Davos really captures something critically important, which is that the global elite inhabit an echo chamber which is remarkably oblivious to all sorts of things. For example, I myself was at a lunch at the Kennedy School here at Harvard the very day that Harvard had announced that it was sending undergraduates home to prevent a serious outbreak here on campus. And all kinds of experts of the sort who doubtless graced the halls of Davos were confidently claiming that this was a massive overreaction and that by the end of the year we would see that there were way fewer deaths from this new virus than there would be from the flu. And from this I take a couple of points. One is that we should never trust policymakers who spend more time talking to each other than they do to real people. And the second point is that real people have every reason, therefore, to mistrust the policymakers, and that this is exactly what fosters the spread of misinformation. What I see happening in this pandemic, and as one sees in many kinds of crises, wars, I think, being rather similar in part, or economic catastrophes is that trends that had already been going on get amplified and deepened. And so the mistrust in authority and in what we could call traditional makers of authority, traditional disseminators of information, has been building for a very long time. And what we're seeing now is the complete collapse of those institutions and the faith in them. How does that resonate with you, and does that fit with earlier historical episodes?
I think that's quite right. I mean, part of what happens when a new pathogen that is both contagious and deadly arises is that trust breaks down at the most fundamental level, in that you can't be quite sure if your neighbor or the person sitting next to you on the plane has the virus, and they can't be sure if you have it, especially if it's a virus like SARS-CoV-2, which can be carried without any symptoms by a really significant number of people who get it. So I think there's a sort of breakdown in the most fundamental kind of trust. And we can see that in earlier plagues, and I think the word's appropriate. You can see, for example, great crises that followed 1918-19, when the countries that were most affected by that particular pandemic saw real and lasting damage to social capital, to trust. But your question's really about the trust we should have in authority. And I think it's not surprising that that has taken a succession of blows, because actually the authorities have not been straight with the people from the get-go. The Chinese authorities in Wuhan, and then at the national level, sought to cover up what was happening and to hush up the doctors who were sounding the alarm in December, and conceivably also in November. We still don't really know what happened in Wuhan, except that there was a cover-up. The World Health Organization was in some measure complicit in that, because it was so keen to ingratiate itself with Beijing. And as a result, there was false information coming from the highest level, from the agency responsible for international pandemic preparedness and disease control. And it gets worse from there on. Not only, as everybody knows, did Donald Trump misunderstand the problem and go through a phase of denying altogether that there was a problem, but I think even worse, when he showed signs of concern in late January and called for a ban on Chinese passengers coming into the US, the entire liberal media erupted in a chorus of indignation, accusing him of racism. And actually, the number of articles that appeared in liberal publications making the argument you just alluded to, oh, it's no more serious than the seasonal flu, I lost count of. There were so many, mostly written by people wholly ignorant of the subject. Then you add another problem into the mix, the epidemiologists. Now, we're frequently told, it's sort of grown out of the Greta Thunberg movement, to trust the science, trust the science. But actually, the science of epidemiology is quite unscientific in some ways. And the really influential model that my near namesake, Niall Ferguson, was responsible for, the Imperial College model. By the way, I'm not him, just in case anybody's wondering. He spells his name Neil, and he's based in London. But his model, which led the British and American governments to panic in mid-March and start authorizing major economic lockdowns, turned out to be entirely a gimcrack piece of modeling that no serious data scientist could believe when they saw it. So I think there's just been multiple failures from the WHO down to Imperial College's epidemiologists, and it's left this humble historian rather staggered. I continue to be staggered at the ways in which people in public office misjudge the problem. A good example of this was the crazy decision by numerous states to shut down parks and beaches. This happened in California, where I'm normally based. You can't really get COVID-19 on a beach or in a park. In fact, it's better for people to be outdoors in fresh air and sunlight. But no, for weeks, those places were closed, and you had surreal episodes like the Californian police arresting a guy who was paddleboarding. The idea that there was anybody remotely endangered by this man paddleboarding was preposterous. So there's just been any amount of idiocy from the WHO right down to national, state, and municipal governments. And I don't blame people for being disillusioned and skeptical about what they're then told. One last point, masks. We were assured that we should not wear masks, that in fact there was no point in wearing them. This was a lie because there weren't enough masks to provide health workers with them. And it's not surprising that when the science made it clear that masks were absolutely crucial and should be worn in any crowded setting, that people were indignant because they had been lied to before on that subject.
On the masks, I would add further that, when the CDC did say that it was advising that everybody wear masks, of course, where are people supposed to get masks? And we see an incredible failure of state capacity. It would be one thing if you said, okay, everyone should wear a mask, and these are the distribution points where you can get one, or we will be delivering them to houses through the post or something like that. But, simply declaring this by fiat and then leaving everybody to fend for themselves is a recipe for lack of adherence, shall we say. Now, you and I manifestly agree on the failures of traditional elites and authorities and all of the errors that have followed on this. But, I'm afraid that we may give people the impression in this that we actually agree about a lot of things when in fact we don't. And I would like to just point to a couple of the comments that you slid into your denunciation of the denunciation I would agree with of certain figures and power brokers, and point our listeners to the way in which you slipped in a denunciation of the liberal media for attacking Trump for stopping flights from China and accusing him of racism, and the other point that you're making about Greta Thunberg and trying to downplay the effects of climate change. And I would like to posit that two things can be true at once. It can be true that these authorities are wrong about how they've been handling the crisis. It can also be true that we have seen a pandemic of racism following in the wake of what Trump himself has labeled the Chinese virus, and that climate science and climate change is a real problem, albeit one that is unfolding on a different time scale. And so I would invite you to perhaps tell us a little bit about why you feel it is important to attack these other issues going on in our times as part of your pandemic study.
Well, I think the point here is not to exonerate Trump. I think he mishandled the crisis in all kinds of ways that have hurt him politically. It's just to try to point out that the problem is not just at the top, and that the media narrative in the US and elsewhere tends to excessively focus on the individuals at the top. In a pandemic, actually, it's not the president or prime minister who's the key player. It's the bureaucracy, that part of the bureaucracy that's responsible for public health policy. And a really interesting question that we need to ask, and it hasn't really been asked much in the press, is what went wrong at the Department of Health and Human Services and at CDC, which is part of it? Why did they screw up so massively in January and February and right into March? Because we know the right response to the emergence of a novel coronavirus. We saw it in Taiwan, we saw it in South Korea. It's actually been a success story as far afield as New Zealand and Australia. But the United States, and I think also the United Kingdom, did disastrously badly. And I think that can't just be blamed on Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. I think it lies much more deeply inside the administrative state. CDC failed disastrously to ramp up testing. It actually managed to reduce the number of tests that were being done. And I think that had to do with its sclerotic bureaucracy. There was a good piece in the New York Times about this, a very rare example of a journalistic inquiry into what had gone wrong in public health policy. But there's a much bigger question that puzzles me. On paper, the United States and the UK were the best prepared countries for a health emergency like this. There were multiple plans, a 36-page document from 2018 in the case of the US, just one of multiple plans produced by DHHS and other agencies. And so on paper, we were ready. In practice, it was a total fail. And I don't think that can be blamed entirely on Trump. In fact, I think it's clear that the people at the top in both the US and the UK were being given very confusing advice by the people whose job it was. Remember, there is an assistant secretary for preparedness at DHHS. His name is Cadleck. You never hear about this guy. He's barely featured in press coverage, but it was his job. And I think that what irritates me is the sense that the media have forgotten that they got this wrong back in January, more or less across the board. Very, very few writers in late January were with me that this was a real disaster and we needed to be taking very early action. They've forgotten all that and turned it into a story about Trump. But I don't think it is just a story about Trump. It's like saying, oh, to give you a completely different example, that the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up when Ronald Reagan was president, therefore it was somehow his responsibility. Disasters, it seems to me, expose failures at the level of public policy and bureaucracy. As Richard Feynman showed in a brilliant book on the Challenger disaster, the reason it happened was that mid-level NASA bureaucrats covered up the risk that their engineers were telling them about. And that's the point of failure that often turns out to matter. Richard Evans, an historian with whom I have a terrible personal relationship, did write a wonderful book on the Great Cholera epidemic that swept Hamburg in 1892. And he showed that the reason that happened was that ultimately the Hamburg city authorities had not been able to get property owners to allow them to modernize the water and sewage infrastructure of the city. And that's the kind of point of failure that I think we as historians should be looking for today, because it's just the kind of thing that we've seen in previous health disasters and indeed other kinds of disaster.
You'll find no dispute from me on those points. I think what I'm interested in as a historian, as you know, are social and cultural ramifications of matters such as the ones you've just laid out, and also social and cultural forces that may go into the creation of such failures. I think one of the really important points that we need to remember about any epidemic, pandemic, disease in the past is the tendency to deepen divides of us and them, and to label certain populations as intrinsically diseased or disease carriers. And I think it is, it's going to be interesting for historians to look at the ways in which, first of all, anti-Asian racist patterns have been activated by this pandemic in ways that were already, frankly, sort of keyed up by trade wars and the rest of it prior to the pandemic. And then I also think that there's a lot to be looked at about the calls for racial justice, which I support, and you probably have a different take on, and the incidence of this in light of the pandemic. So I think we see a couple of different interesting cause-effect loops going on in the intersection here between ethnicity and race and the pandemic. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think future historians will scratch their heads and ask why it was in the middle of a pandemic, because this ain't over, and it's certainly not over in the United States. Americans decided to have a bitter dispute about police violence towards African Americans, a real issue, no question, but it's a strange time to have that argument, and it's especially strange at the time of a new contagion to have people gathering in very large crowds in city centres. This all seems strange, but to a historian it's not so strange, because, as you said, a plague will exacerbate existing social cleavages. It's not so surprising that in the 1340s, for example, in Europe, in the midst of the Black Death, there was a succession of brutal pogroms directed against Jewish communities in German and other European cities. So I think what we see here is a quite familiar pattern where the plague leads to social disintegration, and particularly to attacks on minority groups. It can take other forms too. In the time of cholera in the 19th century, there were often riots when the authorities tried to implement measures designed to reduce the spread of the disease. And so you would have pitched battles between slum dwellers and public officials. This is also a pattern that you and I have both encountered in our work on the British Empire and indeed the French Empire. Empires always seem to end up owning real estate with significant numbers of contagious pathogens. Just try West Africa if you're looking for a place where contagious disease is rife. And so these clashes that were a feature of the age of empire were often clashes between white European bureaucrats and African native populations. So I think this is probably the way to think about the recent upheaval in the United States, that an old and simmering grievance about the way that the police interact with African Americans boiled over after weeks and weeks in which people were cooped up in their apartments without employment. Something was going to blow up. And actually, going back to an earlier point you made, it's interesting that has been the story much more than anti-Asian or anti-Chinese behavior, because I don't actually think that has been a particularly significant feature of life in the United States, despite anxieties that were expressed in the media back in January and February. The big story has been Black Lives Matter. Now, as somebody who's married to an African woman with 2 boys of mixed race, I take this issue very, very seriously indeed. And there is ample evidence that, for example, the police are much more likely to use physical force when they're dealing with African-American suspects. That this is clear. What's not true is the claim that they disproportionately use lethal violence against African-Americans. That's not right. And it's problematic because it's the central claim of Black Lives Matter. And it's just not compatible with the data which show that the police are just as likely, perhaps even slightly more likely, to use lethal force against white suspects. Don't take it from me. I mean, take it from African-American scholars like Roland Fryer and Coleman Hughes who've shown this. At any event, I think the really important point here is that Black Lives Matter has erupted as a kind of huge distraction from the central problem the United States faces, which is COVID-19. There is a second wave of infection and illness now in a majority of states, including some very important states like Texas, for example, and Arizona. And when I look at the American South and the American West, including California, I see a country that has not successfully contained this pandemic and which is on course to have probably another 100,000 deaths between now and the end of the year, leaving out of account the possibility of another wave when schools go back in the late summer. And that's really, to me, the big issue right now that we should focus on. Ultimately, there is going to be a time to discuss ways in which to reform the police, though defunding them doesn't seem like the obvious way. But right now, the United States has a very clear and present problem, which is a pandemic. And to have conversations about police violence in the midst of a pandemic, that does seem to me a little bit like a huge collective aberration, a kind of distraction, which, by the way, probably benefits Donald Trump politically. So from the point of view of the left, it looks to me like a grave error. He was much more vulnerable to the critique that he'd screwed up the pandemic than to this critique, which I think takes him back to the familiar territory of the culture war, where he's a pretty experienced combatant. And the left tends to underestimate the extent to which appeals to law and order can still mobilize a significant proportion of independent as well as Republican voters.
I agree completely that that Trump is on stronger terrain when it comes to a culture war, and that the pandemic has not been contained in the United States. These are indisputable points. I think, however, what was entirely missing from your discussion just now is something of which, of course, you are completely aware, namely that the virus has proved more fatal in minority communities, underprivileged minority communities in the United States, as it has in the UK. The correlation of poverty with heightened exposure and mortality from disease is a correlation that we can trace, of course, historically. In the 19th century, for example, it was a common policymakers' diagnosis that the poor were more prone to disease because of who they were and because of their habits, and therefore we needed to fix their habits and improve them so that they wouldn't get disease. I think it is important that we not fall into the same kind of blaming the victim rhetoric now, and rather than see Black Lives Matter as a distraction, I would posit that what it is the expression of the extremely long-standing, real, as it were, epidemic in the United States, which is that poor African Americans, Latinx populations have been, essentially placed in dangerous situations to their health and safety for an incredibly long time. The pandemic has made everybody see that, and that while perhaps reforming policing is only one piece of a much larger problem, I would suggest that the big problem in the United States is to deal with this radical social injustice and inequality in the American population.
Well, one of the advantages, Maya, of having a deck of nearly 800 slides that I update every week is that I was very quick indeed to notice that there was a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on minority populations. As soon as this was first being reported and was first seen, actually it was in the British data that I first saw it, and then it became clear in the United States. So it's something that I wrote about in that deck, and I've constantly highlighted before the great eruption of popular protest that followed the murder of George Floyd. But here's an interesting a couple of points. The first is that this great imbalance, this great mortality rate that we see from COVID-19 in African American and other populations, Native American mortality is even higher in relative terms, which we also see in the UK, not only in the Caribbean population, but in South Asian origin populations too. This is something that can't exclusively, I think, be explained in terms of socioeconomic inequalities. The problem is that if there are some genetic dimensions to the differential incidence of COVID-19, we're not allowed to research them. And this is a really interesting puzzle, which I would have thought you, as someone interested in genetics and history, would be struck by. There was actually an article published in one of the British medical journals essentially saying there can't be research into the possibility of genetic explanations because that kind of research has some kind of bad history that we can't legitimize. But that's nuts. If we want to study the genetic structure of the virus, and we've done that a lot, we really need to be thinking about genetic explanations for the radically different incidence of COVID-19 around the world. I mean, why has Japan had so much less mortality compared with other comparably large countries? It didn't do any of the things that they did in South Korea and Taiwan. So there's a kind of puzzle here. And I don't like when things are off limits to researchers for what seems to me to be ideological reasons. Science needs to know if there are genetic reasons why some populations are more vulnerable than others. And we can't just say ex ante. It can only be explained in terms of inequality of socioeconomic variables. Second point, of course, there's going to be an argument this year that the COVID-19 has revealed great health inequalities and the need for universal health care in the United States. That argument's already being made. But here's a little problem. The United Kingdom has universal health care. It has a basically socialist system called the National Health Service. And yet we see exactly the same pattern of increased mortality amongst minority groups. Go figure.
A couple of quick reactions to your points, and then we should turn to some of the audience questions which are coming in. On the second point, of course, the NHS has been gutted of funding, as you know well, and also the argument is not that universal health care will mean that everybody is well all the time. The point about the differential mortality in the UK is exemplary of exactly the same problem in the United States, namely that minority communities are radically underserved by the very mechanisms of the state that ought to be helping people out. And why are they underserved? Because defunding, racism, bureaucratic failures, etc. On the first point about genetic issues, I would, having spent, in fact, this past semester studying genetics, I would come back at you with the quick and easy observation that looking for genetic patterns in differential ethnic mortality is opening us up to a possible false correlation. And what you want to do is start your experiment without such expectations already baked in. The possibility that certain people are more prone to dying of COVID is clear. The possibility that there are correlations to be drawn between other kinds of attributes such as diabetes and COVID mortality is also clear. Where that fits genetically is both unclear and arguably not necessarily the most important thing to be studying, in exactly the same way that it is clear that there is racial injustice in the United States, but reforming police departments is only a piece of the problem. The correlation that you are pointing to between genetic risk and ethnic origins is something that would need to be that you're positing as a sort of given, when indeed it's quite questionable. That said,
no, I'm not positing it, Maya. I'm just saying that if we don't research it, we'll never find out.
Certainly studying comorbidities and the reasons for that, I think, would be incredibly important. Yes, whether genetics is the place to look as opposed to various other kinds of health concerns, we can leave to the geneticists to sort out. I would simply say that for all the hoopla about genetic medicine, for now, we continue to be living in a world in which the vast majority of health complaints are both diagnosed and resolved without needing to get into that side of, without that being a helpful approach. So there's a great question from Sachdave here in the chat, and that is essentially, is this pandemic dividing the world? Nations seem at loggerheads with each other. No one is learning from each other, while civic society is flattened, deciding between lives and livelihoods. And I think what this question is really asking us is, where does globalization versus nationalism fit in this pandemic?
It's a great question. Globalization's vulnerable to contagion. That's just inherent in the project of integrating markets for labor as well as for capital and goods and technology. And so what we've done over the last 20 or 30 years is to build the most efficient mechanism for transmitting a pathogen there's ever been. International networks of air travel are an absolutely unprecedented mechanism for transmitting a virus very rapidly all around the world. And that's what happened. And not surprisingly, under those circumstances, the first response of even liberal European states was to make their national frontiers meaningful again, so that they could actually control the inflows of passengers and start checking to see if they were infected. So in some ways, COVID-19 is a kind of perfect illustration of the critique of globalization. It doesn't hurt from that point of view that it originated in China and that China's actions have not exactly been above reproach. So the critique of globalism, which was that it benefited China more than it benefited the US, I think gets reinforced by what's happened. A couple of points. First, Cold War II between the United States and China had already begun, even if slightly hot war between India and China hadn't. I think the pandemic is exacerbating existing geopolitical rifts, but it didn't start them in the sense that these rifts existed before. The second point I'd make is a more optimistic one. Europe hasn't fallen apart, though it seemed as if it might right at the beginning. And if anything, the move in Europe has been to greater fiscal integration, something that some of us called for back in the period after 2008, 2009, and it didn't happen then. And finally, although the US and China are at loggerheads on a whole range of issues, from trade to technology, when it comes to scientific cooperation, I've been very impressed by the extent to which that has continued. And if you want to feel optimistic about the world, then look, as I've been doing, look at the extraordinary outpouring of research that there has been to try to understand the properties of SARS-CoV-2 and the incidences of COVID-19, the disease it causes. Every day I'm reading papers by scientists from all over the world, including Chinese scientists, sometimes working with American scientists. So in the realm of science, I think cooperation has been exemplary, and also competition. There are more than 100 different vaccine projects underway all over the world. The race is on to try and find a vaccine. And although it's a competitive race, it's not one in which I think scientific information is not being shared. On the contrary, you're judged by how quickly you publish the results of your research. So it's not all bad. That would be my response to the question.
Another question from our friend William Dalrymple, who is curious to know predictions going forward. How long do you think we're going to be haunted by this? And I would actually add to that one other thing I've been musing about. You and I have both been emphasizing the degree to which this pandemic is deepening and exacerbating existing problems. Is there any new problem that has emerged from the pandemic that we're all going to be talking about for the next decades that we hadn't faced before this?
Well, I think the two questions, yours and William's, are related. If we're to try and understand what the world looks like, let's assume that there isn't a quick and reliable vaccine that's available on a massive scale. I think that's an important assumption because despite all these many projects that are underway, it's not a slam dunk that you get a vaccine inside 12 months. And there certainly isn't going to be a vaccine this year that's widely available. I think a good analogy is with HIV/AIDS. Once it was clear that HIV was transmitted mainly sexually, you might have expected a radical change in behavior. There was some change, but people continued to have unsafe sex. And HIV/AIDS went on to kill perhaps 30 million people around the world. Well, I think SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 together poses the same threat to social life that HIV/AIDS posed to sexual life. And we will, the longer this disease is around, and it's certainly going to be around in the US for the rest of this year, we will be changing our social behavior. But if the experience of HIV/AIDS is anything to go by, we won't change it enough to defeat the disease. In fact, my expectation is that there will be significant excess mortality in the US in the second half as well as in the first half of this year. Of course, there's a huge imponderable, we haven't even touched on it, and that is just how bad it's going to be in South Asia, or for that matter in sub-Saharan Africa. We already know it's a disaster in Latin America. South America looks like it's going to be an even bigger mess than North America, but it's still quite early days. Suffice to say that every week I track the numbers for India and for Pakistan, and the trend is not your friend in terms of infections and in terms of mortality. So I think the world is going to be dealing with the virus for many, many months to come. Historically, pandemics are at least 2-year affairs. That's the lesson of the great influenza pandemics of the last century and a bit. And what's fascinating to me is that from very early on, the epidemiologists forgot history and told a story about one curve that you had to flatten. And I said from the outset, this is nuts, because all the great pandemics come in multiple waves. 1918-19 saw 3 distinct waves. 1957-58 saw 2 and maybe 2.5. So I think, William, we're going to be confronting second waves. Well, we already are confronting second waves in the United States. And there is one big wave that still is far from cresting, I'm afraid to say, in South Asia. As for the new problems, it seems to me that we've accelerated the virtualization of our life. This conference is happening via a technology that really didn't work reliably only a few years ago. But this is transforming the way a very significant proportion of us can work. I can do my job from home. Even if my home's in the middle of bloody nowhere, in Montana. I can do it actually in some ways better than when people expected me to fly around the world on long-haul flights every week to conferences. And I think this is the new problem, that we actually can do an awful lot virtually. My 8-year-old son took to distance learning, to my amazement, like a duck to water, and reported that he was finding that he was learning more and faster in this new situation without the distractions of the classroom. Now, this is in some ways great, but it also propels us much faster forward than we'd expected into the world of the matrix, a world in which really half our lives, maybe more than half, takes place in the virtual world, not in the real physical world. And I think that will turn out to have all kinds of shadow sides that we Zoomers, we compulsive Zoomers, have yet fully to appreciate.
I would add to the point about the analogy to HIV as the future that we're going to have is going to be one in which access to the vaccines is going to be a make or break difference between societies. It's very different if you get HIV in New York City from if you get it in South Africa. Anyway, thank you, Neil, for those reflections. Our time is up, and I believe Sanjoy has a few words to say about further JLF programming.
Thanks, Maya. Maya, I'm not hearing Sanjoy. Are you?
I am not hearing Sanjoy. I'm not sure what our audience is hearing, but he popped up in the dialogue.
Unfortunately, I think we're having really bad